Breaking news tonight out of Washington, where Donald Trump has just been criminally indicted for a third time. The former U.S. president was charged with 4 counts tied to efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Special counsel Jack Smith addressed the charges last hour.
Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to disenfranchise voters, and conspiring and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. The indictment was issued by a grand jury of citizens here in the District of Columbia, and it sets forth the crimes charged in detail. I encourage everyone to read it in full. The attack on our nation's capital on January 6, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election.
Trump has been summoned to appear in federal court on Thursday. 6 unnamed co-conspirators are also included in the indictment. The charges mark the unprecedented third criminal indictment against Trump since he launched his 2024 presidential bid. No other current or former U.S. president has ever faced criminal charges. NBC News correspondent Alice Barr joins us now live in Washington. So, Alice, what more can you tell us about the new charges Donald Trump is now facing?
Yeah, Andrew, I think it's worth just looking at the weightiness of what we're talking about here. This is the third indictment against former President Trump, and it would be easy to look at that and say, we've been here before, but this is different. You know, we're talking about, for the first time in history, a former U.S. president is accused, now charged with attempting to overturn the results of an election that he had lost. That is what is laid out in this indictment that I have right here. And it's very detailed. You know, a lot of times these are described as talking indictments, speaking indictments, to really try to talk through the charges. I heard a legal analyst say this is sort of a shouting indictment because it really spells out exactly what the special counsel's office thinks that former President Trump did wrong here, leading up to, of course, the deadly Capitol attack on January 6th. Now, it's important to note that former President Trump has not actually been charged with inciting the violence on that day, but he is charged with 4 new counts that are related to 3 separate criminal conspiracies. And I want to get this right, so I'm going to read. Those conspiracies are to defraud the United States by dishonestly trying to defeat the government's lawful steps to collect, count, and certify the election. Also a conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, and that is specifically in Congress on January 6th, the steps that were underway to certify the election results on that day. And then a conspiracy against the right to vote and have one's vote counted. And again, these are allegations, criminal charges against a former president of the United States that alleging these are the things that he tried to stand in the way of. The indictment alleges that former President Trump spread lies that he had not actually lost the 2020 election, that the only reason it looked that way is because of widespread fraud, and that he took steps trying to act on that. And that, quote, these claims were false and that Mr. Trump knew that they were false. That is important, trying to establish the intent, the mindset of former President Trump, because in order to prove these counts in a court of law, it's important to show that former President Trump not only, thought that he had won this election. In fact, it's spelled out here in this indictment that the defendant had a right, like every American, to speak plainly, publicly about the election, and to claim, even falsely, that there had been widespread fraud and that he had in fact won. That's not the crime, but and that he was entitled to formally challenge the results of the election through lawful and appropriate means in the courts. He did that. In each case, he was defeated, and it was shown that there was no evidence of widespread election fraud, but that what was the crime that they're alleging here is the steps he took to try to overturn the results of the election, even knowing that, in fact, they're alleging he had, in fact, lost that election. So it lays out, a number of different arguments for why they believe that's the case, the special counsel's office. And one of the biggest prongs sort of this is a scheme, a fake electors scheme, where there are allegations that former President Trump and his allies tried to reject states' electoral votes and use fake electors who would back former President Trump instead. So that's the kind of content that we're seeing in this. Again, not specifically about inciting violence on January 6th, but about spreading lies that led up to that and trying to stand in the way of the functions of the government to try to certify the election.
And Alice, has there been any reaction from Donald Trump himself and the campaign as well to these new indictments? Or what have we heard?
We have heard from the campaign, again, calling this a witch hunt. They have been making the argument all along that former President Trump is being targeted only because he is now the leading Republican candidate in the 2024 presidential election, and that he's being targeted by the Department of Justice, of course, which is President Biden's part of the administration, that this is intentional, it's election interference. That is what you hear over and over from the Department of Justice, from President Biden. You're hearing a very clear effort to delineate, to insulate the administration from the special counsel's office, Jack Smith, who actually made these charging decisions. So they're pushing back forcefully on that. But certainly that is the drumbeat from Trump's team, from his allies, from his legal team. That's the argument they're trying to make. And we've heard from former President Trump himself in the past that he had every right to contest an election that he fully believed that he had lost. Again, using that language to say he believed he had lost the election and he had a right to contest it. Again, now seeing that the steps he took are what they're arguing were not allowable.
And so, Alice, we're obviously watching for two areas to go. One is the trial itself and when that could all take place, when Donald Trump, we expect him to appear on Thursday. But then, of course, the impact on his bid to become the Republican nominee in the primaries and on the 2024 election, which is just over a year and a bit away.
That's right, yeah. And, we heard today from Special Counsel Jack Smith that he wanted this case to move forward in a timely manner, and you can bet that he's looking at the clock and he's aware of what's coming up. And so he knows that there's a window here if he wants to try to get this in front of a jury before the general election of November of 2024. He is aware of that. So yes, he's due to be in court on Thursday to be arraigned that day. And of course, this is not the only legal battle that former President Trump is facing. So when you look ahead, over the next several months, we're going to start, starting in the beginning of the new year, we're going to start having Republican primary contests. And during that time, in between, when he's out campaigning in Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina, whatever it may be, he's going to be dealing with a number of court appearances on a number of different cases. And this is all just on a collision course as we look ahead to these two major events, the upcoming election and the upcoming trials of a former president of the United States, plural, on multiple charges. Andrew.
Alice, thank you. That is NBC News correspondent Alice Barr, live in Washington. So for more on this, I want to bring in Joe Moreno. He is a former U.S. federal prosecutor. We reached him in Alexandria, Virginia. And Joe, always good of you to take the time in these very significant moments in your country's history. Just your reaction to the indictment. I know you've probably had a chance to peruse it quickly, as I have, and also to Jack Smith's short statement.
Hey, Andrew. Well, a couple of things that jumped out. One, as Alice correctly pointed out, the indictment does not directly tie Donald Trump to the violence of January 6th. I think that would have been quite difficult because prosecutors would have had to show that he specifically intended for violence to be committed. And so I think a lot of us felt it was unlikely he would be charged in that way, and he wasn't. Instead, what he's charged with is a much more complicated legal theory that effectively he knew he lost the election and he carried out all of these activities to defraud the government and the American people by changing the results, right? By basically telling Congress the results that all of us believed were true were in fact not true, and they should change it. And that's basically what it is. And what's interesting is, as Alice also correctly pointed out, this means that prosecutors have to show that Donald Trump knew he lost. Now, that sounds easy, I think a lot of us felt he lost, but that's different than proving it in court beyond a reasonable doubt. And so that'll be interesting to see how prosecutors apply that theory.
So let me ask you a little bit more about that, because it is a 45-page indictment. They do go into some details about how they plan on laying all of that out. What did you make of where it would appear as though they will make that case or attempt to make that case?
Well, I think to establish that knowledge that he lost, I think what prosecutors will do, very similar to what the January 6th Commission argued, was that person after person we know told Donald Trump, hey, Mr. President, you lost the election. That includes former Attorney General Bill Barr, who Donald Trump tasked with looking into all kinds of alleged election fraud. And Bill Barr came back and said, we didn't find any. Sir, you lost. Same with the Director of National Intelligence. Same with most of his attorneys. So when person after person tells you you've lost the election, it's hard to then argue that you still believe you won. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of evidence to that in that respect. I suppose Donald Trump's defense can always be, I thought what I thought, and good luck proving otherwise, in which case prosecutors will have to show, look, there's all this evidence that Donald Trump knew he lost, and yet he spewed these lies trying to change the outcome. So I think it'll really come to that battle of knowledge and intent.
Now, the charges also allege that Trump conspired to defraud the U.S. by preventing Congress from certifying U.S. President Joe Biden's victory and depriving voters of their right to a fair election. So can you unpack that for us?
So this seems to derive from the theory of one of Donald Trump's attorneys, John Eastman, who tried to, or apparently did convince Donald Trump that the vice president, Mike Pence, under the Constitution, could single-handedly decide who had won the election when Congress did its certification on January 6th. Now, the vice president presides over this, effectively a ceremony that happens every January 6th after a presidential election, and it's basically a rubber stamp, right? What John Eastman had told Donald Trump was that it wasn't just a rubber stamp, that the vice president could actually pick which states' electoral results were accurate and which weren't. And of course, that's how we calculate presidential victory, is through electoral votes, not through a popular vote. So first, Donald Trump tried to convince Mike Pence that he had this authority and that he should change how the election, what the election outcome was. When Mike Pence refused, then Donald Trump repeated this publicly, and that led to people marching down to Congress to exercise, their will on Vice President Mike Pence. And so all of this stems from a very, very shaky legal theory. And again, it's going to come down to whether Donald Trump really believed that theory and really believed he was permitted to set into the course of action that he did, or whether this was absolute nonsense and no reasonable person could possibly have believed this was true.
I mean, in the indictment, in the second paragraph, it says, despite having lost, the defendant was determined to remain in power. So for more than 2 months following Election Day on November 3rd, 2020, the defendant spread lies that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the election and that he had actually won. These claims were false, and the defendant knew they were false, but the defendant repeatedly and widely disseminated them anyway to make his knowingly false claims appear legitimate, create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger, and erode public faith in the administration of the election. So in the wording of the indictment, they really make it clear, according to Jack Smith in this language, that Donald Trump knew that he had lost, knew that he was spreading this information. But as you say, this is just something that it's one thing to kind of put that in words in an indictment, but then of course you'll have Donald Trump's team, right, that will kind of fight back against these allegations. How do you expect that to play out?
So I can see two sub-issues that both sides will be fighting over. One will be whether any politician has the right to legally contest the results of an election. And so I can see the president's defense team saying, well, we had the right to kind of push and prod and see if the election results were correct. And I can see the prosecution saying, yeah, to an extent. and a candidate can do that, and there are legal means, but you tried those means, and none of them played out well for you. So I can see that being one push and pull. I can see the other ones where Donald Trump tries to assert basic First Amendment rights, saying, I have the right to say all kinds of things, even if maybe they're not true, in which case I can see prosecutors rebutting and saying, okay, yes, everyone does have First Amendment rights, but at some point when your words veer into fraud, and you're the president, and you're trying to stay in office, and you're trying to convince other people to keep you in office, that's now gone well beyond free speech, and that gets into the area of fraud and obstruction. And so it'll be interesting to see these little battles playing out. Of course, if this goes to trial, and if in fact we get to see the ins and outs of that trial, it'll be really fascinating for us lawyers, and probably for everybody. Okay, so why do you say that if this goes to trial? Because you can see some kind of plea deal, and what do you expect to happen? We know that he's expected to appear, to be arraigned on Thursday. How quickly could all of this play out in court? Well, lots of speculation about what exactly a speedy trial really means, right? So, of course, first off, there are two other prosecutions ahead of this one, right? There's the state charges in New York, and then there's the federal charges regarding the Mar-a-Lago classified documents. So right off the bat, this is kind of third in line. But of course, we also have a presidential campaign over the next 18 months. And so I am still very, very skeptical that any of these cases will possibly go to trial before next year's presidential election. I can't imagine, and that's assuming Donald Trump is the Republican nominee. He might not be, but as of right now, it looks like that's likely. If he is, I can't imagine any judge telling a candidate to come off the campaign trail and appear in court. So I think, not to mention the complexity of these cases, will give the defense lots of ability to stretch this out. So when they go to trial, it'll be probably well into 2025. And then, of course, that's if they go to trial, right? That's if a deal is not worked out. And it's one thing for Donald Trump to talk tough right now. But I think if the walls really do come closing in on him, and these are, look, I've raised questions about these cases, but they're serious cases. And Donald Trump has serious exposure here. So I have to think that while his public persona may be one of being very combative, inside, I gotta think he's talking with his advisors and lawyers about figuring out some kind of compromise to reach a plea deal. How serious, I mean, it almost seems ridiculous to ask you this, but I mean, how serious is this case against him? What kind of legal jeopardy could he face in terms of penalties if he were to be found guilty? Well, all these cases we've talked about are serious. I happen to think that the one in Mar-a-Lago with the classified documents actually probably holds the most exposure for Donald Trump, because I think it's the easiest case to prove. This one, I think, is a little dicier because the legal theory has to be creatively applied to these very, very bizarre set of facts. But they're all very serious, and they all represent potential jail time, potential financial fines, potential other loss of liberty, like house arrest or having to relinquish one's passport. What's interesting, though, of course, is what they don't do is bar someone from running for office again. And I know that international audiences find this bizarre, but the fact is Donald Trump can be charged in all these cases, can even be found guilty in these cases, and can still run and win the presidency, as strange as that sounds. I just want to ask you, in terms of some of the reaction that we've heard from the Trump campaign and from Donald Trump himself, describing this, you know, as a witch hunt. Also, you know, a Trump spokesperson likened it to the indictment to Nazi Germany in the 1930s, the former Soviet Union, and other authoritarian dictatorial regimes, calling it un-American. Donald Trump stating on social media that why didn't they do this 2.5 years ago? Why did they wait so long? Because they wanted to put it right in the middle of my campaign, prosecutorial misconduct. What do you make of these kind of arguments that we're hearing from Trump and the campaign? I'll take that comment about communist Russia and Nazi Germany kind of personally, because it is very American to hold people accountable when they violate the law. And look, Donald Trump, these aren't manufactured cases. People can argue whether or not they should be brought now in terms of the timing. People can argue about different legal theories and which ones apply and which are stronger than others. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump put himself in this situation. He has created real legal exposure for himself based on his own actions. No one forced him to do this, and there are consequences for that. And so that's very American. And frankly, look, I'm glad to see that there is some attempt at holding people accountable, because otherwise, if you don't, people will try to get away with whatever they can.
Joseph, always good to talk to you. Really appreciate you taking the time once again. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. My pleasure.
Joseph Moreno is a former U.S. federal prosecutor.